Welcome to the exhibit!
Let's talk a bit about randomness. Obviously, there are a lot of random effects in Hearthstone, way too many to go over in a single video. Instead, I'm going to focus on the worst offenders, and how the nature of the most aggravating random cards has changed over time. How did we go from Animal Companion being the most frustrating random card in Classic, to the absolute randomonium of Deck of Lunacy? I believe that there are two types of problematic randomness which seem to pop up again and again in Hearthstone. These are generating way too much stuff and being too consistent in the result. Join me for a journey through the worst offenders for these types of randomness throughout the history of Hearthstone. In Classic, random effects were fairly few and far between. The most frustrating random card at the time was probably Animal Companion, which summoned either Leok, a 2/4 which gave +1 attack to all of the hunter's minions, Misha, a 4/4 with taunt, or Huffer, a 4/2 with charge. When played by you, the card seemed to always have the worst effect possible for the situation, and when played against you, it seemed to always have the best effect possible for the opponent, usually Huffer. That said, the randomness was fairly controlled. There were only 3 options, and using the option that you got to the best possible effect was fairly skill testing. Skipping ahead a bit to Goblins vs Gnomes, we saw cards like Crackle and Implosion printed. Crackle and Implosion were fairly divisive, as the randomness there was that sometimes the spell was simply better than other times, and there wasn't anything you could do to skew the outcome in your favour. If you rolled a 4 for Implosion, the card was insane. If you rolled a 2, the card was pretty bad. Crackle was similar in that sometimes it simply did more damage. The very nature of these cards meant that pretty much whenever one was played, someone would be frustrated. If the roll was low, the person who played the card would be frustrated, and if the roll was high, the opponent would be frustrated. There was a lot of argument in the community at the time over whether or not this was a good direction for Hearthstone to head in, with prominent figures like Reynad arguing that this kind of randomness was simply bad design, the video for which I will link in the description. Fortunately, this type of randomness was something that was fairly rapidly phased out of Hearthstone after Goblins vs Gnomes, presumably for the reasons that we have just outlined. But in its place, we would start to see a new type of randomness, one that initially seemed much fairer, but would ultimately have a history fraught with nerfs and changes. This was, of course, random card generation. The build-up to Whispers of the Old Gods was an interesting one, with much debate centering around a card called Yogg-Saron, Hope's End, which cast a random spell for each spell the player had cast this game. The card proved to be incredibly difficult to evaluate, as nothing like it had really been seen before at the time. Some content creators insisted that it was a complete meme, but others argued that it would be completely broken through the sheer value that it provided. The second group was ultimately correct. The card would generate a positive effect on average, and so saw use in pretty much any spell-heavy deck as a value generator or potential finisher. Some of you may know that this card was extremely controversial at the time, and this was not for any of the reasons discussed so far. Yogg demonstrated the first problematic type of randomness which we would see reoccur in the future, just generating way too much stuff. Ultimately, the card was such a large RNG factor in games that people were winning the game off of the back of Yogg-Saron from positions that should have been almost certain losses. This wasn't just happening on ladder, but at all levels of play, even professional, and the frustration from the community on this matter was very evident. Many called for the card to be banned completely from competitive play, something which never ended up happening, but it was the first time a measure like this had even been considered as an option by many Hearthstone players. The card ultimately wasn't that effective statistically, but it was included just for the chance to win the game from an otherwise losing position. There were many moments in pro play where the outcome of the entire game was gambled by playing Yogg-Saron. Many times it made no difference, but for the few times that it did, the frustration factor was through the roof. The card was eventually nerfed in the next expansion so that it would stop casting spells if it killed itself in the process. This pretty much killed the card in terms of competitive viability, as it was highly likely that Yogg would die before getting off the full cast sequence. For the first time in Hearthstone history, Blizzard had completely killed a card with nerfs, and the community was almost unanimously happy about it. The next major offender would come during Kobolds and Catacombs, in the form of Spiteful Summoner. Spiteful Summoner was a 6-mana 4/4 which revealed a spell in your deck, and then summoned a random minion with the same cost. Needless to say, this card had the potential to summon a 10-cost card at 6 mana, and saw plenty of play in classes with big spells, like Warlock, Priest, and Druid, often alongside Grand Archivist, which could cast these extremely expensive spells for a discount. The next random terror deck was born. The average stats for a 10-mana card were around 10/10. So for 6 mana you were getting 14/14 worth of stats on average, on turn 6. Furthermore, Spiteful Summoner didn't use the spell in any way, so you could play both Spiteful Summoners reasonably reliably if you had 2 copies of an expensive spell in your deck. Needless to say, most decks could not deal with 14/14 worth of stats on turn 6, and the game was often decided on the spot by this card. If Yogg demonstrated the first problematic type of randomness, then this card demonstrated the second type, being too consistent in its output. Let me explain why this is a problem. A random 4-drop is on average going to be worse than a 4-drop that you would include in your deck. So if a random effect generates a 4-drop, the effect is probably on average only worth 3 to 3.5 mana, rather than the 4 stated. As such, most random cards budget for this in their cost. Take Piloted Shredder for example. A 4/3 body is slightly understated for 4, so the body could be valued at around 3 or 3.5 mana. It then generates a random 2-drop, which is probably only worth 1 or 1.5 mana on average, so the card is usually generating somewhere between 4 and 5 mana worth of value. For a 4-cost card, this is reasonably fair. The problem comes when the result of the card can be manipulated too reliably. If Piloted Shredder always generated a card like Succubus, then the card would be consistently worth 6 to 7 mana, which is obviously very strong for a 4-drop. This is what happened with Spiteful Summoner. The average stats of a 10-drop were fairly consistently grouped around 10/10, so the value of the card was very consistent. Even if you value a vanilla 10/10 at 8 mana, which is being very conservative, and Spiteful Summoner at 3 mana for the body, the card is consistently generating 11 mana worth of stats for only 6 mana, which is extremely good. The card was again widely disliked by the community. Generating a massive ball of stats which could not be answered and then just won the game didn't feel very interactive to play against, and it would feel like the RNG was always going in your opponent's favour, since they always got good 10-drops, when in reality the 10-drop pool was just good in general. The card was ultimately nerfed from 6 to 7 cost, which reduced the value of the card, and pushed the minion generation back another turn, so that more decks could deal with it. The card still saw a reasonable amount of play in Standard, and even Wild after the change, but it wasn't the meta-defining annoyance that it had been previously. We would then go for a while without a massive randomness incident, until the rise of Shadows, which would start to see Mage becoming a bit of a hot topic within the community for all the wrong reasons. Mana Cyclone was a 2-mana 2/2 with the battle cry, for each spell you've cast this turn, add a random mage spell to your hand. This card was never actually nerfed, but it did form the core of many mage decks for pretty much the entire time that it was in Standard, and in my opinion fell prey to the first randomness issue of just generating way too much stuff. Popular mage spells at the time like Ray of Frost, Magic Trick, and Elemental Evocation made it easy to stack up 4 or 5 spells cast in one turn for a massive value generating turn with the Mana Cyclone. The 2-mana 2/2 body isn't even that bad for the cost, and it would generate half a hand worth of cards, all of which were usually useful, since Mage had a fairly high average spell quality. While this great value generation is good for the mage, for the opponent it was extremely frustrating to see the mage completely refill their hand with just one cheap card. On top of that, you didn't even know what cards they now had in their hand, making playing around these new spells extremely difficult. This card itself wasn't that bad, but it was representative of a bigger problem forming within the game. Excessive card generation made playing around your opponent's deck near impossible, as you just never knew what they had in hand. Evocation was released in Ashes of Outland and filled a similar role to Mana Cyclone, just for 1 mana cheaper and without the setup. This fell into both randomness traps. It provided too much value, and it was too consistent. The card was often used from a near empty hand to close out games by generating a whole new hand of spells. Again, the spell quality in Mage was very high on average, so there were almost always some offensive spells offered by Evocation, which could then be used for the final push to close out the game. Evocation also fed into the excessive card generation problem. Why bother to play around your opponent having 2 copies of a certain card when they can just generate a 3rd or 4th copy for no real cost? The card was used in pretty much every mage deck in Standard for the entirety of Ashes of Outland, before being nerfed to 2 mana during Skullman's Academy. This significantly reduced the flexibility of the card, as you had to invest more mana to play it, leaving your options afterwards more limited than before. Nevertheless, the card still sees play in a lot of mage decks, just for the flexibility that it provides. Madness at the Darkmoon Faire saw the release of several random cards, which the player base were rightly wary of before release. Surprisingly, the second attempt at Yogg-Saron, Yogg-Saron Master of Fate, did not end up as problematic as the first. Instead of casting random spells, the card would spin the wheel of Yogg, producing a variety of ridiculous effects. In order for this to happen, however, the player would have had to have played 10 spells this game already, a significant investment. The payoff itself was not as game-breaking as before, with only a 5% chance of ending the game and a 95% chance of generating one of the other board-altering effects, a 19% chance of each individual effect occurring. Unfortunately, one of the other cards introduced had a much more unexpected effect on the health of the game. Deck of Lunacy was printed for Mage, and there was plenty of debate before release around whether or not this card was good enough to see play in a Spell Mage deck. Ultimately, the answer was sort of. The deck performed pretty much the same with or without the card, so while fun, it wasn't particularly game-breaking. The effect had the potential to be quite annoying, however, as completely replacing your deck with random spells left the opponent with no insight as to what you could possibly have in your hand, often leading to an atmosphere of frustration around losing to the card. The standard rotation that took place at the start of Forged in the Barrens was one of the largest ever, removing the classic set and replacing it with the core set, a new set of cards available to every player for free, which would change every standard year. This was largely interpreted to be a positive change by the community. It should have shaken up the meta and enabled some new archetypes to thrive. Unfortunately, there were some unintended consequences. Deck of Lunacy had become absolutely insane. The pool of available spells had changed, such that the overall spell quality in Standard was much higher, especially at the 10 mana slot. Mage had both Flamestrike and Mask of Cthulhu as good 7 mana cards, which would be upgraded to 10 mana cost spells by Deck of Lunacy. The only 10 mana spells in Standard were Nagrand Slam and Survival of the Fittest, which were both very powerful, especially for 7 mana. Furthermore, the cards could be reduced even more if the mage had played Incanter's Flow at any point that game. The result was insanely discounted random spells like Nagrand Slam coming down at 5 or 6 mana, 7 at worst. The deck was also very consistent in drawing cards, due to the availability of cheap card draw like Arcane Intellect and the newly printed Refreshing Springwater, which allowed the mage to draw 2 cards for 0 mana if their deck was all spells. Sometimes it was even better. If Refreshing Springwater had been reduced by another card, it was possible to draw 2 cards and gain 1 or even 2 mana. The combination of all of these things made the deck feel absolutely terrible to play against, and there was very little chance that an early Deck of Lunacy play could be overcome by anything except very specific decks. It has been confirmed that a nerf is already on the horizon for Deck of Lunacy. I would expect a change to 4 or even 5 mana, but we'll have to wait and see exactly how the nerfs play out. It's a fact that the number of new random card generation effects in Standard has been reduced in Forged in the Barrens, but in the shake-up, the effects of the core set changes on some old cards were overlooked. We must look back at the mistakes of the past and assess how they happened, lest we are doomed to keep repeating them in the future. Unfortunately, these randomness problems seem to just keep cropping up. And most worryingly, they crop up in the same way as they always have. Random effects that are too consistent, and random effects that just generate way too much stuff. All of the problematic random cards in the past have fallen into one of these two categories. Deck of Lunacy falls into both. I really hope that Blizzard is more careful when introducing effects like this in the future, as they have the potential to get out of hand and become frustrating very easily. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. There are plenty of topics that I could have covered in this video that I decided not to. For example, I didn't talk about Priest at all, really. I think the problem in Priest is subtly different from what was discussed in this video, where Mage is generating just loads of random cards and just a huge volume of cards all at once and closing out games or generating huge board swings. What Priest is usually doing is they just have too many cards that generate one other card, right? So you end up with chains of these really long discovers where you just have no idea what is really in the opponent's hand. Let me know if you want me to do another video on that, but I thought it was kind of subtly different to the problem that I'm talking about here, so I decided to omit it just because the video would have been way too long if I had covered that as well. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching all the way to the end. It really means a lot to me. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed the content. Leave a comment maybe down below saying what kind of topics you might like to see covered in the future. I've got a few more video ideas for stuff that's coming soon. I won't give anything away, but it's always nice to have more ideas on that front. Thanks, and see you in the next one.